It's Game Boy World, and this is a Game Boy sidebar. I've mentioned Gunpei Yokoi before here on Game Boy World. After all, you can't properly talk about the system without reflecting on its designer. Yokoi didn't simply lead the construction of Nintendo's first handheld console. His design philosophy shaped the direction of the Game Boy, as well as many of its successors. Though he died nearly 2 decades ago, his writing and sensibilities continue to be an integral part of Nintendo's creative DNA to this day. When Nintendo hired Yokoi back in 1965, they couldn't possibly have known how important and influential a thinker they'd inducted into their assembly line division. But he quickly proved his worth, as previously mentioned, demonstrating his knack for gadgetry by creating what would become Nintendo's first ever toy hit, the Ultra Hand, something he made as a goof in his free time. Yokoi had his hand in numerous Nintendo toy projects throughout the 60s and 70s, many of which, such as Duck Hunt, were destined to become immortalized as classic NES games. Retailers usually treated video games as an extension of toys rather than electronics back in those days, so perhaps it's unsurprising that Yokoi's work steadily shifted from playthings to electronic entertainment as the 1980s dawned. Yokoi made his mark forever in video game history with the Game Boy and Game & Watch systems, 2 portable devices built around his philosophy of creating affordable entertainment by using commoditized components and stripping out superfluity by paring down a gadget or device to its basics. Game & Watch used dirt-cheap LCD watch screens and processors in a novel and entertaining way. Game Boy paired an aging Z80 processor to barely tolerable passive matrix grayscale LCD screens. And yet both devices managed to overcome their limitations and their competitors alike. But perhaps the purest example of Yokoi's philosophy at work comes not in a video game, but rather in the form of LEFTY RX, a low-cost remote control race car. As its name suggests, the LEFTY RX had a distinctive design quirk: it could only turn in a single direction. While the idea of a race car that can only turn left may sound absolutely daft, it's exactly the sort of lateral thinking that Yokoi valued. By stripping out the complex mechanisms that other remote control cars used for full steering, the LEFTY RX could be manufactured at a fraction of its competition's price. Even the remote control itself was less expensive to make, needing only a single button rather than a full steering wheel. The car operated in a binary state. And for race cars, being able to veer only to the left isn't even that big a limitation. A classic racetrack consists of an oval, right? So in a proper race, a car is only turning in one direction anyway. By looking critically at the standard toy RC car and applying some massive but logical cuts to the design, Yokoi created a version that made modest but not crucial compromises to play value, while coming in at a fraction of the cost of the competition. Years later, Game Boy would apply the same philosophy to handheld gaming, stripping out color graphics and processing power, but still managing to produce a satisfying, if crude, simulation of the NES experience on the go, and at less than half the cost of the Atari Lynx with far lighter battery demands. When Nintendo shuffled around its internal staff into divisions around the time that the Famicom launched in Japan, Yokoi was given the role of Division Chief for Research and Development 1, a more technically focused group than Shigeru Miyamoto's Entertainment Analysis Division. R&D 1 is generally regarded as Nintendo's legacy division, credited for the creation of arcade games stretching back into the 1970s, as well as most of the early black box games. But assuming that R&D 1 and EAD split apart sometime after the release of the original Mario Bros., Yokoi oversaw all the odd non-Miyamoto Mario games such as Wrecking Crew. Beyond the system's initial post-launch era, R&D 1 made its greatest mark on the NES with the 2 silver-boxed password pack games, Metroid and Kid Icarus. These introduced the idea of complex passwords to allow players to restore their game after a break. Older games had used passwords, but in a much simpler and more finite form. Though actually in an elegant kludge to compensate for those games' move from the rewritable Famicom disk system in Japan to read-only carts in the US, the password design was quintessential Yokoi as well, even if the innovation wasn't necessarily his. A much less expensive way to achieve the same effect. Even after the advent of battery backups for carts, passwords allowed publishers to create persistence in their game, without needing to incorporate the expensive battery option. Under Yokoi, R&D 1 created some of Nintendo's most intricate games. While games by Miyamoto's EAD were characterized by their innate elegance and fluid feel, R&D 1's tended to be more complex and experimental. Metroid combined the platform action of Super Mario Bros. With the RPG-like adventure mechanics of The Legend of Zelda, and Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally saw the company making its first foray into 3D effects. R&D 1's NES output slowed around the time the system started to gain traction in the West, because it was around this time that Yokoi was given the task of creating a portable NES. That, of course, was the Game Boy. So you already know the story there. But that system too was quintessentially Yokoi-like in design, compromising fidelity for low cost and ease of use. That same philosophy defined even the unpopular Virtual Boy, the ungainly game device that many regard as Yokoi's greatest and career-ending failure. Virtual Boy resulted in a financial disaster for Nintendo, but it was a clever hack of a device. The problem was that Yokoi approached the hack from the wrong direction. Rather than thinking about it as a gaming device first and foremost, designing Virtual Boy around the needs and ergonomics of video game players, he appears to have approached it from the other way around, asking, how can we make a virtual reality device into a consumer-level product? That approach worked for things like Game & Watch and LEFTY RX, but that's because the choices and compromises Yokoi made for those devices complemented their function. Virtual Boy, on the other hand, lacked a certain essential clarity of function and purpose. Now, taken from the perspective of contemporary VR setups, Virtual Boy was a masterpiece of economy. At the time, VR game systems were huge, elaborate, expensive devices that proved too prohibitively costly to install at single arcade locations. Instead, they had to tour the country as events. Virtual Boy cost less than $300. But Virtual Boy didn't really offer a VR experience. It amounted to a high-resolution Game Boy sporting a depth of field effect. And the device was cumbersome, uncomfortable, and unpleasant to play on. In terms of usability, it fell afoul of the mistakes that bogged down Game Boy's competitors, but even worse. And you know, that's fine. Even geniuses make mistakes. Unfortunately, Yokoi never had the chance to recover from his. He left Nintendo in the wake of Virtual Boy's failure, possibly having fallen into disfavor. Reportedly, he personally demoed the system to press and buyers at E3 and Space World 1995, a menial task for someone of his seniority and stature in the company. Yokoi's follow-up endeavor, Koto, only produced a couple of products before he died in a highway accident in October 1997. The most notable of these was the Wonder Swan, a true Game Boy successor that he designed for Bandai. Wonder Swan was clearly meant to serve as a back-to-basics project for Yokoi, a palate cleanser in the wake of Virtual Boy. It took every tenet on which Game Boy had been built and did them all one better. It was even less expensive, even more battery efficient, even more portable, with twice the shades of gray available to the screen and far more processing horsepower. At the same time, Wonder Swan made compromises for the sake of value. It required an adapter for the headphone jack, and its form was so slim, its battery compartment created an unsightly bulge on the backside, and that was all part of its charm. Of course, Wonder Swan was made instantly moot by the debut of the Game Boy Color, but it was a great return to form for Yokoi. One can only wonder how different the face of gaming might be today had he lived into his 60s or 70s. The keen combination of economy and usability he brought to Nintendo's hardware lineup and the quirky sense of creativity that accompanied them remains unique in video games. Only Nintendo continues to carry forward his philosophy of inventive applications for aging and expensive technology. In fact, one could argue that Nintendo only fares well when it operates according to Yokoi's tenets. The withered, unconventional tech of the DS and Wii resulted in two of the best-selling consoles of all time. More robust systems like Wii U, GameCube, and 3DS haven't fared nearly as well. Yokoi may be nearly 20 years gone at this point, but his legacy and his shadow loom over Nintendo, and over gaming at large. Even today, the medium as a whole only stands to prosper by preserving, and living by, Yokoi's example. For more on portable gaming legends, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com.